Sophie's heart sank as she walked up the front steps of the house she once called home. The familiar scent of her mother's lavender-scented candles filled the air, but something felt off. She opened the door, and there, waiting for her on the floor near the entrance, were her bags. The sight alone was enough to make her stomach churn. The disorienting mix of confusion and hurt rushed over her, threatening to break through her usually composed demeanor. Her mother, Claire, stood near the kitchen, avoiding eye contact. Sophie could tell something was wrong immediately. Her mother's tense posture, the way she crossed her arms tightly over her chest, it all screamed discomfort. David, her new husband, was sitting at the dining table, his smug expression unmistakable as he barely acknowledged Sophie's presence. "Mom?" Sophie asked, her voice shaky but determined to keep it steady. Claire didn't respond immediately. She turned to face Sophie, a cold look in her eyes before letting out a sigh. "You heard me. Your new dad doesn't want you here anymore, Sophie." "It's time to leave," Claire said bluntly, her words cutting through Sophie like a razor. Sophie's breath hitched, but she didn't let the tears that were threatening to spill fall. She wasn't going to show weakness, not now, not in front of them. She clenched her fists at her sides, holding herself upright even as her world seemed to crumble around her. She had never imagined it would come to this, not in her worst nightmares. She had always tried to be the good daughter, tried to get along with David, but now it was clear that no matter how hard she tried, she was nothing more than a burden. Claire's voice was sharp, almost dismissive as she continued. "You've been nothing but trouble since David came into our lives. You disrupt our new family. Maybe if you weren't so selfish, things would be different." Sophie stood frozen, her chest tightening as her mother's words echoed in her mind. Selfish? She had never asked for any of this. David, the new family, the growing distance between her and her mother. She thought back to the days when they used to be a team, when Claire would hold her close and promise that everything would be okay, no matter what. Those days felt like a lifetime ago now, replaced by the harsh reality that she had lost her place in the home she once thought was hers. David let out a laugh from his seat at the table, his voice low and condescending. "You think you're so important, don't you?" he sneered. "You're just in the way." Sophie's face flushed with anger, but she kept silent. He had no idea what he was talking about. None of them did. Her mother's love had always been conditional. First, it had been Sophie's father's absence that caused the strain, and now it was David's presence. Claire's face softened momentarily, but there was no warmth in her gaze. "It's just better this way, Sophie. It's time for you to grow up." Sophie nodded stiffly, swallowing the lump in her throat. The silence that followed felt unbearable. She didn't know how to respond, didn't know how to make them understand the weight of what they were doing. But deep down, Sophie knew one thing: this wasn't over. It couldn't be. With her head held high, Sophie turned and walked toward the door, her bags in hand. There was no turning back, and as the door clicked shut behind her, she couldn't help but feel the smallest sliver of resolve forming in her chest. This was her life, and she wasn't about to let it slip away without a fight. She didn't need them. She would show them just how wrong they were. As Sophie walked away from the house, each step felt heavier than the last. The cool autumn air did little to soothe the sting of betrayal that seemed to pierce through her heart with every breath she took. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the harsh reality she now had to face. It wasn't just about being kicked out. It was the fact that her mother had made a choice. She had chosen David, her new husband, over her own daughter. The weight of that decision was something Sophie couldn't quite fathom, but the hurt was undeniable. Sophie's mind drifted back to the time before David entered their lives. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Her father had left, and Sophie had been forced to grow up faster than most children her age. But her mother had been there. She had always been there. Claire had been her rock, her comfort, the person Sophie could turn to when the world felt too heavy. Sophie could still remember the nights when they'd sit on the couch together, her mother brushing her hair and telling her that everything would be okay. It was a love that had always felt unwavering, a bond that had seemed unbreakable. But then David had come into the picture, and everything began to change. Sophie couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when it happened, when her mother had started to pull away from her. But it had happened slowly, insidiously. At first, Sophie had been hopeful. She tried to accept David, to be the daughter her mother wanted her to be. But no matter how hard she tried, it never felt like enough. She watched as Claire and David built their life together, side by side, while Sophie was left on the periphery, forgotten and ignored. It wasn't just the way David had dismissed her, it was the way Claire had allowed it to happen. Sophie had always been the priority before, her needs, her happiness. But now, Claire had a new priority, David. Sophie had been pushed aside, made to feel like an inconvenience in the very home she had once felt safe in. The subtle but powerful change in her mother's demeanor had been the hardest part to bear. Sophie had seen the way Claire's eyes would soften when David entered the room, the way she would laugh at his jokes, while Sophie sat quietly, a silent observer of their growing bond. Sophie tried to understand her mother's actions, to make sense of how things had gone so terribly wrong. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that Claire had made a choice. She had chosen the man who could provide her with the stability and the life she thought she wanted over the daughter who had always been there for her. Sophie could no longer deny it. Her mother had traded the love they once shared for the comforts that David brought into her life. The thought of it made Sophie's chest ache, but she refused to let her tears fall. No, she wasn't going to give her mother the satisfaction of seeing her break down. Instead, Sophie stayed composed, her silence louder than any word she could have spoken. She wouldn't beg for her mother's love. She wouldn't plead for a place at the table. She would no longer fight for something that was never meant to be. The deep sense of betrayal she felt was consuming her, but Sophie knew one thing for certain. She would not let it define her. She could feel the resentment growing inside her, but it was a quiet resentment, a simmering anger that she kept buried beneath the surface. She wasn't going to lash out, wasn't going to scream at her mother and David. No, she would remain dignified. But deep inside, she couldn't ignore the sting of abandonment, the painful realization that her mother had chosen someone else over her. The hurt would always be there, but Sophie would carry it silently with grace. As she walked away from the house, Sophie made a promise to herself. She would find a way to rise above this. She would prove to herself that she didn't need them. She would carve out a future for herself, one that didn't rely on the love and approval of those who had abandoned her. And no matter what happened, she would never allow them to see how deeply they had hurt her. The air in the house felt heavy, stifling, as Sophie walked toward her room. She had packed a bag earlier that morning, when her mother had told her to leave. But Sophie hadn't just packed it because she had been forced to. No, today was different. Today, Sophie was packing her things for good. She wasn't just leaving. She was taking control of her life for the first time in a long while. The weight of her decision was sinking in, but Sophie felt strangely calm. She paused at the doorway to her room, staring at the walls that had once felt like home. It was hard to believe that just a few months ago, she had shared laughter and warmth with her mother here. Now, the silence that filled the house was deafening, and Sophie could feel every inch of that emptiness. Sophie turned toward the mirror and looked at her reflection. The girl she saw staring back at her wasn't the same girl who had walked into this house full of hope, expecting her mother to be there for her, to protect her. That girl had been naive, unsure and vulnerable. But now, Sophie saw someone stronger, someone who had grown up too fast, but was finally starting to understand her own power. She wasn't going to beg her mother for anything anymore. No more pleading for love that would never come. No more hoping for a family that was already broken beyond repair. Sophie had spent far too long pretending everything was fine when it was anything, but she grabbed her bag, the weight of it not as heavy as the emotional burden she had been carrying for months. She moved to the living room, where her mother sat with David, talking like everything was normal, like Sophie wasn't even in the room. It was as if her mother had forgotten she existed, and in some ways, Sophie had begun to believe that maybe she didn't. Sophie paused, watching them, her heart aching with a mixture of pain and anger. She wanted to scream at them, to tell her mother how she had failed her, how David had taken her place in their family. She wanted to ask her mother why she had chosen him over her, why she had pushed her aside so easily, so coldly. But Sophie knew better than to make a scene. She had learned over the years that words were useless when they weren't heard. No matter how much she tried to speak, it felt like the walls between them grew higher and thicker. The tears that threatened to spill from her eyes remained trapped inside, and Sophie could feel the burn in her chest as she held them back. She wasn't going to give her mother the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Not now. Not ever again. The tears were for Sophie to release, on her own terms when she was ready. But for now, she had to be strong, even if it meant walking away without a word. She walked out of the living room, the door closing behind her with a soft click that felt like the finality of an ending she hadn't been able to avoid. Sophie didn't look back. She couldn't. If she did, she was afraid the sight of her mother and David would break her once and for all. Instead, Sophie walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped outside, the cool air hitting her face like a slap of reality. She didn't know where she was going, but that didn't matter anymore. She had spent too many years waiting for her mother to choose her. Now, it was time to choose herself. With every step away from the house, Sophie felt the weight of her past begin to lift, just a little bit. She wasn't free, not yet, but she was taking her first steps toward something better. Her mind was swirling with 1,000 emotions: hurt, betrayal, fear. But through it all, Sophie remained silent. She wasn't going to allow her mother's indifference to define her any longer. She wasn't going to stay in a place where she wasn't wanted. She wasn't going to let anyone, not even her mother, take away the strength that had slowly but surely begun to grow inside her. She had made her decision, and Sophie knew that, for the first time, she was taking control of her own life. She had to leave, for her own sanity, for her own future. It wasn't just about walking out of the house. It was about walking away from everything that had held her back, from the lies, from the rejection, from the pain. And as she walked away, she vowed that she would never let anyone make her feel small or insignificant again. She would rise above this, quietly, silently, but with a strength that would carry her through. This was her moment of freedom, and she wasn't going to waste it. Sophie's new life was a delicate balancing act. After walking away from everything she had known, she now found herself in a small, quiet apartment with her best friend, Leah. It wasn't much, but it was hers. There were no arguments, no cold stares, no dismissive comments. It was a sanctuary, a place where Sophie could rebuild herself, far from the world that had discarded her. But even in this safe space, the loneliness crept in. Sophie had always been the quiet one, the one who preferred to keep her feelings to herself. But this silence felt different now. She hadn't expected it to feel so heavy. Leah was kind, always there with a smile or a word of encouragement. But Sophie couldn't escape the feeling of abandonment that gnawed at her every day. Her mother, once the center of her universe, had become a stranger. The love she had once craved from her felt like a distant memory, like something Sophie had imagined long ago. In the early days of her new life, Sophie struggled to find her place. She would wake up to a world that felt foreign, no longer defined by her mother's expectations or David's harsh words. Her room, now shared with Leah, felt less like a refuge and more like a reminder of what she had left behind. There were nights when Sophie would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had made the right choice. Would things have been different if she had tried harder? Could she have fixed the relationship with her mother? But those thoughts quickly faded when Sophie reminded herself of the reality. Her mother had chosen David. She had chosen her new life over her daughter, and Sophie couldn't live in that shadow anymore. As the days passed, Sophie began to focus on what she could control, her future. She threw herself into her studies, determined to excel. It wasn't easy. She missed the sense of security she once had, the way her mother had been the one to help with her homework or give advice when she needed it. Now, Sophie was navigating the world on her own, but there was a quiet strength in her that she hadn't recognized before. Every page of a textbook, every late night spent studying, felt like a small victory. She wasn't just learning about biology or history. She was learning about resilience. She started to understand that happiness didn't come from being accepted by others. She didn't need her mother's love or David's approval or anyone else's validation. It was a hard lesson to swallow, but Sophie was beginning to believe it. She could create her own future, independent of the people who had once tried to define her. And maybe, just maybe, that was the freedom she had been searching for all along. The struggle wasn't over. Sophie still had moments when the loneliness felt suffocating, when memories of her mother's cold words would replay in her mind. She still had nights when she wondered why her mother had pushed her away. But with each passing day, Sophie learned to live with the pain, to carry it without letting it weigh her down. As she sat at her desk late one evening, the glow of her desk lamp casting shadows across her textbooks, Sophie felt something shift inside her. She wasn't the girl who had left home all those weeks ago, uncertain and heartbroken. She was someone new, stronger, silent but unbreakable. She had faced the worst, and she was still standing. And that, Sophie realized, was the first step toward true freedom. Sophie's new life was not easy, but each day brought a new chance to reclaim her happiness, piece by piece. It wasn't the loud, triumphant kind of growth that most people expected. There were no dramatic outbursts, no public declarations of victory. Instead, it was in the small, silent moments where Sophie felt her strength beginning to bloom. At school, Sophie found herself excelling in her classes. Her grades were higher than ever before, a reflection of the dedication she poured into her work. Her mind was no longer clouded with the constant turmoil of home life. The teachers began to take notice of her silent determination, seeing a side of Sophie that had been buried under years of emotional neglect. She had always been a bright student, but now something had shifted within her. Her focus was sharper, her ambition clearer. Outside of school, Sophie started to build a life of her own. She and Leah, her best friend, had found a rhythm in their shared apartment. It wasn't glamorous, but it was their space, and for the first time in a long while, Sophie felt a sense of peace in the simple comforts of her new life. She could cook her own meals, decorate the walls with pictures that made her smile, and leave her things scattered around without fear of judgment. But the most significant change was internal. Sophie began to understand that her happiness didn't depend on anyone else's approval, least of all her mother's. In those quiet moments when she was alone with her thoughts, Sophie realized that the validation she had once desperately sought from Claire and David was unnecessary. She didn't need their love or acceptance to prove her worth. She was strong in her own right, even without their support. There were days when Sophie would reflect on the warmth of the family she once had. She remembered the laughter around the dinner table, the sound of her mother's voice filled with affection. But those memories, though bittersweet, didn't break her anymore. They simply reminded her of who she used to be before David came into their lives and things changed. Now, Sophie was building a future without the shadow of those memories holding her back. One evening, after an exhausting week of exams, Sophie sat in her room, staring at the window. The world outside seemed vast and full of potential, and for the first time in a long time, Sophie felt ready to take it all on. She was no longer a victim of her circumstances. She was shaping her own destiny. Her dreams had never felt more achievable. She began to plan for her future with a clarity that surprised even herself. She thought about college, about the career she might pursue, and the places she wanted to see. For the first time, Sophie didn't just wish for a better life. She started to build it, brick by brick. Every small victory, every new lesson learned, added to her growing confidence. The quiet strength Sophie had cultivated over the months began to shine through in everything she did. It wasn't about proving something to anyone else. It was about proving it to herself. Sophie had come a long way from the broken, abandoned girl who once had nothing. Now she had everything she needed, herself. And that was enough. Her future was no longer a distant hope. It was within her grasp, and she was ready to take it. David's life seemed to be falling apart in ways he had never anticipated. The house, once filled with the laughter of family, now felt empty. Claire's attention was divided, her focus shifting from him to the growing rift between them. Their relationship, once full of excitement and newness, now seemed strained, like a thread slowly unraveling. The absence of Sophie, a silent but undeniable presence in their home, left a void that neither Claire nor David could ignore. David had never been one for reflection. His world revolved around control and dominance, but the reality of Sophie's departure gnawed at him. At first, he'd been relieved. His life with Claire was simpler without the constant reminder of a daughter he never wanted. But now, it was clear that Sophie's absence was slowly tearing at the fabric of their family. Sophie had been a constant in the background, and without her, the house felt eerily still. No more quiet laughter from the kitchen. No more late-night talks about school and life. As Sophie thrived in her new life, David found himself plagued with frustration. The more Sophie grew, the more he realized just how much he had underestimated her. She was no longer the weak, helpless girl who had silently taken his insults. She was strong, independent, and the thought that she was thriving without him made him uneasy. For all his talk of being the patriarch, David had lost control, and that loss was unbearable. Meanwhile, Claire began to notice changes in Sophie's life from afar. Though she didn't want to admit it, she couldn't help but be impressed by Sophie's strength. The girl had always been quiet, but now Sophie seemed unstoppable, focusing on her future, excelling in her studies, and gaining a sense of independence Claire had once dismissed as immaturity. Claire had never understood Sophie's need for approval, but now, in the silence left in her absence, Claire was forced to reflect on the choices she had made. Had she really chosen David over her own daughter? The guilt began to creep in, but Claire kept pushing it down, choosing to ignore it rather than face the uncomfortable truth. David, feeling cornered and desperate, finally decided to reach out to Sophie. He had spent months trying to forget her, pretending she no longer mattered. But as his own life began to unravel, the need to reassert his control over her became more pressing. He wasn't sure what he expected, perhaps an apology or a simple return to the home he had abandoned her from. But when he reached out to Sophie, he was met with nothing but silence. The call came one night, his voice carrying an edge of frustration and desperation. "Sophie, I need to talk to you." David's voice crackled through the phone. "You can't just walk away from your family like this. You're causing problems that you don't even realize. I thought you were better than this." He tried to sound authoritative, but the words fell flat. Sophie had heard it all before, the manipulation, the blame, the hollow promises. Sophie listened, her grip on the phone tightening. She had expected this moment, had known it was coming. She was tempted to say something, to lash out, to tell him everything she'd felt over the years, but she stayed quiet. David's words didn't affect her anymore. She wasn't the girl he could control with guilt or manipulation. She had nothing left to prove to him. "I'm not coming back," Sophie replied quietly, her voice calm but resolute. "I'm not the same person I was when I left. I've grown, and I'm not going to let you drag me back into a toxic environment." David's frustration was palpable. He tried again, this time with more force. "You don't understand, Sophie. You're making a mistake. You belong here with us. Your mother misses you, and—" "No," Sophie interrupted. "You're the one who doesn't understand. I'm not the one making a mistake. I'm moving forward with my life, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else pull me back into the past." She could hear the silence on the other end of the phone as David struggled to find words. This time, there were no arguments, no attempts to manipulate her. Sophie had said what needed to be said, and David knew it. With one final, calm exhale, Sophie hung up the phone, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was in control. As the phone call ended, Sophie knew her decision had irrevocably altered the course of her life. She was no longer bound to the family that had abandoned her. She had freed herself, and David's desperate calls were nothing more than echoes of a life she was done with. Sophie's life continued to transform in ways she had never imagined. With each passing day, she felt the weight of her past slip further away, replaced by the excitement of new opportunities and her growing independence. She had learned to thrive in the silence of her decision. With the sting of her mother's rejection and her stepfather's cruel behavior had once left her fragile. Now, there was nothing fragile about Sophie. Her internship at a prestigious law firm had come at the perfect time. Sophie had impressed her mentors, and before long, she was entrusted with more significant responsibilities. Her work ethic, combined with a sharp mind and determination, allowed her to shine brightly in an industry where competition was fierce. Sophie had already started to make a name for herself. She didn't need to speak loudly or make a scene. Her success did the talking for her. As she poured herself into her work, Sophie remained focused, determined to build the life she had always dreamed of. Her job allowed her to explore new possibilities, and the sense of fulfillment she had long craved slowly but surely filled the emptiness left by the family who had abandoned her. She realized that the pain of the past no longer had the power to dictate her future. Her growth was becoming more than just a personal triumph. It was a statement to anyone who had ever doubted her. But as Sophie's star continued to rise, so did the downfall of her stepfather, David. Once the man who had sneered at her, laughed at her aspirations, and tried to dismiss her as unworthy, he now found himself drowning in a sea of financial troubles. His businesses, once thriving, began to flounder. Investments went bad, partnerships crumbled, and the promises he had made to people began to unravel. He was no longer the confident man who had mocked Sophie's every move. Now he was a man struggling to keep up with a life that was slipping through his fingers. Sophie didn't know the specifics of David's financial ruin, but she knew enough to see the cracks in his world. Her life had moved forward, but his was spiraling downward. The universe, it seemed, was giving him a taste of the abandonment and neglect he had inflicted on her. It was karma in its most silent and powerful form. Then one day, Sophie received a call that would test her newfound strength. David, desperate and scrambling, reached out to her through a mutual connection, requesting help. Sophie's name had been recommended in certain circles, and it turned out that the prestigious firm she worked for had a hand in some of the financial services that could either save or destroy David's businesses. The request was simple. Sophie had the power to assist him, to use her connections and position to pull him out of the mess he was in. It was an opportunity for her to finally face him, to have a say in the life he had tried to control. Sophie could almost hear David's voice in her head, the same voice that had once belittled her and dismissed her potential. He wanted to crawl back to her for help, to take advantage of her success. But Sophie's resolve was unshakable. She wasn't going to let him dictate her actions anymore. The old Sophie, the one who had sought approval, the one who had wanted to prove her worth, was long gone. This new Sophie had nothing to prove. She had built her life without him, without her mother's support, and without the toxicity that had once bound her to them. She thought for a moment, weighing the offer carefully. In the past, she might have felt a sense of satisfaction in helping him, in showing him that she could be the one to lift him from the consequences of his actions. But that would have been her old self, a person seeking validation from those who never cared. No, Sophie realized, she didn't need him to acknowledge her success. She didn't need his gratitude or his approval. With a quiet sense of justice, Sophie declined his request for help. She didn't owe him anything, not after everything he had done, not after the way he had treated her. In that moment, Sophie realized that her success, her growth, and her independence were the ultimate forms of revenge. She didn't need to confront David. She didn't need to make him apologize or admit his wrongdoings. Her silence was her revenge. Her strength, her growth. Her refusal to return to the toxic life he had offered her. It was all the justice she needed. Sophie had taken back her life, and she was no longer the girl who had been discarded. She had become something much stronger, something David could never control. Her dignity, her silence, and her success were the final, unspoken victory in a battle that no one had even seen coming. As Sophie moved forward, her focus remained unwavering. She would never forget her past, but she would never let it define her. Every achievement, every quiet step she took toward her future, was a reminder that no one, not even David, could take away her strength again. Sophie had learned to live without her mother, without the toxic environment she had once called home. She had built her life piece by piece, creating a future filled with promise, independence, and quiet strength. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined her. She had grown stronger, more resilient with each passing day, and as her journey continued, Sophie had come to realize that she didn't need her mother's approval to feel validated. She had found her own worth, not through others' eyes, but through her own reflection. Then, one day, her phone rang. It was Claire, her mother's name flashing across the screen. Sophie hesitated for a moment, her finger hovering over the decline button. She didn't need to answer. The years of emotional neglect had taught her that much. But something inside her urged her to pick up the phone. Maybe, just maybe, Claire had finally come to terms with her actions. Sophie answered. Her mother's voice sounded different, quieter, filled with a hesitation that was new. "Sophie," Claire said softly, I'm sorry for what happened, for the way I treated you. I've been thinking a lot about everything, and I know I failed you as a mother." The words hung in the air, but Sophie didn't rush to respond. Her mother's apology was long overdue, but Sophie felt no rush to forgive. She had already forgiven herself, long before this moment. Her mother's remorse didn't change the truth. Sophie had learned to live without her. "I've hurt you, and I know it's too late to fix that," Claire continued, her voice cracking with emotion. "But I want you to know I'm sorry." Sophie listened in silence, not because she was angry, but because she had nothing left to say. She didn't need Claire's apology to move forward. She had already moved on. She had given up the idea of being loved by her mother, understanding now that love could come from within, from herself. The idea of needing validation from Claire was no longer a part of Sophie's life. "I hear you," Sophie said finally, her voice calm, unwavering. "But I've learned something important. Forgiveness isn't about you. It's for me. I've let go of the past. I've moved on." The words were simple, yet they held all the weight of her journey. Sophie had forgiven herself for the mistakes of her past, and in doing so, she had freed herself from the need for approval. She didn't need her mother to say the words, or even to understand her choices. Sophie had already found her peace. The conversation ended quietly, and as Sophie hung up the phone, she took a deep breath. The air felt different now, lighter, freer. Sophie realized she didn't need to carry the burden of her mother's expectations anymore. She didn't need to prove anything. She was enough, just as she was. Sophie didn't turn back. She continued down her path with dignity and strength, leaving behind the toxic relationships that had once defined her life. The journey was far from over, but Sophie knew that wherever she went, she would do so on her own terms. And for the first time in her life, she was truly free. Her growth wasn't defined by the past or anyone else's actions. It was defined by her own quiet strength, her resilience, and her ability to rise above the hurt. Sophie's story was a testament to the power of moving forward, of finding strength within, and of leaving behind what no longer served her.